All right, hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about social documentary. This coincides with chapter 8 of the book. Definitely make sure that you are still reading the chapters since obviously I'm going to be doing a little bit less lecturing with these videos. So this is probably going to be a little bit long, as was last week's. Hopefully moving forward they're going to get a little bit shorter, but we're still only doing one a week, and I'm guessing that this is probably going to be around an hour. We'll see how much I talk. So today we are very familiar with the use of camera images as visual evidence alongside campaigns. And usually the aim is to raise awareness or address specific social concern. And this potential, particularly the photograph as visual evidence, as we've discussed already, right, was realized from the beginning. The characteristics of social documentary, and I've kind of included this Walker Evans image here as an example of that. The characteristics of social documentary that we're familiar with today didn't really emerge until the end of the 19th century. And this was shaped partially by the development of new photographic and printing technology in the 1870s, right? So silver gelatin, halftone printing, we'll talk a little bit more about them. Uh, but also by the emergence of social reform movements who would mobilize photography to their cause. So we've looked at many early examples of the camera as a tool to document, to provide evidence. Prior to 1880, nearly any unposed, unmanipulated image might be considered a document. All photographs might be considered documents in one sense or another. And many of these images dealt with people, their work, relationships, everyday life. This is more of a sociological study in this example. Obviously, the Roger Fenton images. Itinerant tradesman, John Thompson. We're going to talk about John Thompson in a little bit as well. And, we've seen social situations in carte de visites, on postcards, albums, snapshots, images of artistic and photojournalistic intent. Many of these documentary images might deal with social themes. They might illustrate or document working class concerns, in this case, foreign culture. They're not attached to specific claims of social problems or as evidence of a solution to one of these problems, right? There's not quite that attachment to some kind of rhetoric that we're going to see with later stuff. So this specific style that we're familiar with today doesn't emerge until the end of the 1800s when technology has caught up. And again, this is development of silver gelatin, which allows photographers to get into places they previously couldn't, as well as Woodbury type engraving, which is a kind of relief engraving process. It's photomechanical. And halftone printing, which uses these little dots to faithfully reproduce photographs. So Woodbury type and halftone printing are much more faithful. They're much more photographic than having an illustration made from a photograph, right? So these are both photomechanical. They don't really involve the hand of the artist at all. So this technology has to catch up, as well as the emergence of reform movements, as we discussed, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in detail. But as well as the learning of the public as to how to read and accept and value photographic imagery, as well as photographers learning how to best capture the public's eye. And I discussed this Mexican War photograph. So the Mexican War technically is the first human conflict to be photographed in 1847, just a few years after the invention of the camera. But this photograph was not published, it was not used, it was not exhibited, it wasn't really seen, right? And it couldn't compete with lithographs at the time, which the public was more familiar with, which obviously a little bit more idealized, right? A little bit less realistic, but told a much more dramatic story, especially when compared to the daguerreotype. So there is a a need for the public to learn to value the realism of the photograph, and there's a need for the photographer to not idealize his subject matter, but capture the public's attention and have some sense of drama and elevate them beyond mere recordings. So the arrival of the social documentary style, this is another great example of what we would view as a traditionally social documentary styled image. The arrival of this style coincides with the progressive era in US history in the 1890s. So prior to this, problems of urban poor were largely ignored by the government. This was more the domain of private charitable organizations, Red Cross, these sort of things, and churches. So the progressive era in US history was a period of widespread social reform, and it was in reaction to rapid industrialization, immigration, urbanization, and political and economic corruption. So this progressive movement happens worldwide, but I think it's more, particularly in the photographs we're going to look at, it's more of an American thing. That's not to say that social documentary is an American invention or anything like that. Just that the level of industrialization, the amount of corruption, the lack of regulation, the nature of the country being only a little over 100 years old at this time, I think exacerbates these things here. So the progressive era leads to the establishment of regulations for housing, the creation of things like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, breaking up monopolies through antitrust laws, things like prohibition, suffrage for women, amongst many, many other examples. And again, this is not a purely American trend. There are obviously similar movements occurring across the West. The use of the camera follows them as well. Again, these social problems, these movements aim to address, were exacerbated in the United States, where urbanization and immigration, particularly if we think about places like New York City and Ellis Island, happened at a much more rapid pace. And so the problems were much bigger. Here's another great example. So Beaumont Newhall, who I've quoted before, he was a curator and art historian, an authority figure on photography. He wrote another very popular, famous history of photo book that I would recommend if you're looking for research sources, these kind of things. He defines the social documentary approach as a kind of blending between factual and subjective qualities of the medium. The quality of authenticity inherent to photography, the indexicality between photograph and object, and the realization that photography is subjective and a powerful tool in grasping criticisms of reform movements. And I think if you look at some of the social documentary stuff, you will see the influence of pictorial photography in it, the ability to capture the public's eye. So the purpose of documentary is in some sense an anti-aesthetic one, right? Documentary is not art. Its goal is not to be informative. Its goal is to be informative and not artful, right? Its job is to faithfully reproduce without gimmick or trickery and present an unmanipulated view of reality. That's the theory anyway, right? So there's a paradox here between the need to be objective and factual as a source of evidence and the need to elevate these images beyond mere recordings. To be effective, it has to be aesthetically powerful, and it must kind of use artistic faculty to give vivification to fact. And this is a Beaumont Newhall quote. He's quoting poet Walt Whitman here. Vivification, 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 meaning to bring to life, to animate, to make an image that is going to be emotionally resonant with the viewer. So I think that's where you can start to see the influence of pictorial photography. Obviously, there's not going to be any kind of painterly effect after the fact, but the attention to light, the emphasis on composition, and I think particular light is something that social documentary photographers lean on quite a bit. Obviously, this Louis Hine image is relying on a quality of light that's very important to the overall emotional impact of the image. The eyes looking back out with a portrait, establishing an emotional connection, right? So there is some subjective qualification that's needed, right, in the photograph. So let's move on to some earlier stuff. Louis Hine comes much later. He's much more iconic of what we recognize as social documentary today. But let's look back to some of the earlier stuff. So we talked about Hill and Adamson when we looked at the calotype process. And so in 1845, they photograph working class people in the fishing town of New Haven, Scotland. So these images are part of a conscious effort to document working people. And it's one of the first projects to attach itself to a specific socially beneficial purpose. And in this case, that's raising awareness and funds to provide better equipment and improve the safety of fishermen. So New Haven, Scotland is a fisher folk town. It's also a very dignified, emotionally compelling portrayal. And this sort of dignified, compassionate look is very, very characteristic of social documentary. So this is very much the style of social documentary, and I think this is probably, I don't know, I would regard it as one of the first kind of truly socially oriented documentary projects, in that it's attached to a specific purpose. But the technology at this time, remember, thinking back to daguerreotype and calotype, there is no mass production of photographic images happening at this time. So the technology to reproduce and distribute these kinds of images was not even close to the scale of projects that we're going to look at in regard to Louis Hine and Jacob Riis and some of these other figures. So another example, these are cartes de visites. This is Dr. Thomas John Bernardo, who was a self-appointed evangelical missionary. He opened these homes for destitute lads in London in 1857. And he used these before and after cartes to illustrate the effectiveness of these homes, these enterprises. This is an example of a private/religious group taking up the philanthropic role of helping the poor instead of the government. So, we're probably familiar with the before and after kind of image in the form of made-for-TV advertising. Today and at the time, I think these images are problematic. At best, they're mainly cosmetic, and at worst, they're totally faked. I mean, all you need to do is scrub the kid up and put him in new clothes and then put him there, and boom, he's been helped. Similarly to like diet pills and stuff, right? The before and after pictures, I think, are traditionally taken at the exact same time. Suck it in for the after, and then just relax or stick your gut out for the before diet pill, before and after commercial. So anyone who's seen this kind of advertising will know, right? It's kind of classic. There's all kinds of memes out there. So his use of the camera, like, now a little workman, his charitable organization and his use of the camera are both kind of ethically questionable at best, I think. Despite this, the before and after becomes a staple that obviously continues today. Even in more, reputable sources, not made for TV kind of imagery, the before and after still exist for sure. This is a powerful early example that comes from the firm of Raja Deen Dayal. This is 1899, Types of Emancipation. It still tends to generalize rather than paint a specific emotionally charged message, but it certainly effectively illustrates the impact of relief programs for children suffering from famine. So it's difficult to categorize early photographs which dealt with social themes, work, living conditions, the cultural stuff that we looked at with Felice Beato. The motivations and goals of these photographers are varied and complex. They don't follow a standardized practice, and most of them are not attached, again, to the kind of specific claims that we're going to see with later examples, with the exception of Hill and Adamson with their Fisher folk. Most of these are not attached to really specific claims. So remember, with photography right now, there are no standards or discursive rules for how these kinds of images are made and used. So rather than attempt to categorize these images, which deal with social themes, I think we can look at them as part of a broader growing interest in problems of work and social existence. And this was not something that was specific to just photography. We saw everyday life in genre painting. We saw it in all kinds of different forms with pictorial photography, right? Our buddy Gustave Courbet in the left, the example is called Stonebreakers, and Ford Madox Brown's work are emblematic of the general growing interest in problems of work and social existence. I think these images in particular, because they're dealing with kind of industrial work, signal the mounting concern surrounding the social and ethical consequences of industrialization. And that's really what the reform movements, the early ones in the late 1890s, that's really what they're responding to, are the ethical and social consequences of rapid industrialization, which occurs in the 1800s. We're going to go off on a tangent here. Oh, that's kind of blurry, isn't it? That's too bad. The Madox painting here is similar to Reyhander's Two Ways of Life, as discussed last week, in regard to its anecdotal theme of good versus evil. But Two Ways of Life also illustrates the moral choice between virtuous hard work and sinful laziness. So another Rejlander image called Hard Times. I didn't include it. All right, hang on. Shame. You guys can look at all of my stuff on my desktop. It's great. So here we go. This is Hard Times. It's titled after a Charles Dickens novel of 1854 by the same name, obviously. The Dickens novel dealt with similar working class concerns. This image, Hard Times, was much less derivative and moralistic than Two Ways, and it illustrates the anxiety of unemployment. It's a portrait of an out-of-work carpenter. He's anxiously awake while his wife and child are sleeping behind him. Superimposed over it is almost a religiously idealized pose of him with his hand on her head, so he's kind of blessing her, while their son, I don't know if you can see it very well there, while their son is praying at their feet. So for me, this kind of illustrates his fears of being unable to meet his moral and religious obligations to his wife and to society. I felt like that was kind of a particularly topical photo. Well, many people are facing unemployment, and we're all kind of feeling guilty for not being able to work and not taking advantage of all of our time off. It feels like there's a big push to try to do something productive with all of this free time while we're stuck in isolation. So I feel like that was a little bit topical and worth taking a second to veer off on a tangent. So despite the early realization of its potential for social documentary work, it's going to take some time for photography to be effectively combined with a social activist message. In part, that's due again to the technology and use of the camera, as well as the literacy in reading and accepting the value of the photographic image. But it also just takes some time for literature and the kind of familiar format of photojournalism today and documentary photography today to kind of be established. And one of the first kind of prototypes is Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor. This is a serial publication that appears in 1850. It's one of the first publications that involves images made from the camera alongside text. So this is using illustrations that are made from the daguerreotype, and it's these are a couple of example illustrations here. These were placed alongside written accounts of lower class urban life. So you have Her Majesty's rat catcher, and he's got his little rat emblem, his little cage, his terrier rat dog, this guy who is selling birds' nests. The intention was to bring the reality of working class existence home to readers, particularly people that might not be familiar with the urban experience. So obviously the translation from photograph to illustration to engraving creates a less than desirable impact, right? These guys are kind of become idealized types, similar to pictorial photographs, the way they typified certain forms and figures. Nonetheless, the format, which is authentic language, first-hand account, accurate and compelling visual illustration, the format was established, and this becomes the bedrock for sociological documentation, which we still use today. So here's a slightly later example. Again, going back to John Thompson, we saw the itinerant tradesman in the Far East images that he had produced. So here he is coming back to London to photograph street life in London, 1877. Again, right here is our text along with compelling visual imagery. And this image here is a Woodbury type engraving. So these were, again, photomechanically made from a negative. It's a kind of gelatin relief. So it hardens proportional to light, so you can expose a negative over top of it, and it will create a relief from that negative, which can then take ink, hold ink, and make a print. So these were photographs taken by John Thompson expressly for the purpose of this book. And they were placed, again, alongside written accounts by author Adolph Smith. And so I think you can just see, in comparing the illustrations here to the Woodbury type engraving, the photomechanical reproduction of a silver gelatin negative, that it's much more impactful, and certainly as a visual source of evidence for the text written here, very effective. And this kind of goes back to Sarkowski, where photographs on their own are a little bit too ambiguous. They need to be contextualized through text. They need to be anchored to specific meanings, to specific social causes. So, returning to New York, we're going to talk about Jacob Riis. So in New York City, millions of first-generation immigrants who were enticed to come to the United States with the promise of work, fulfilling the demand of cheap industrial labor, many of them were either homeless or living in very crowded tenements and slums. The prevailing middle-class opinion, which is depressingly familiar today, was that the poor were responsible for their own poverty. And so Riis, and here are just some unknown photographer images of people emigrating at Ellis Island. So Jacob Riis was a police reporter. So he started off as a writer. He was a police reporter for the New York Herald. And he's a link between this earlier Victorian attitude that the poor are responsible for their own poverty and emerging reform attitudes towards social problems, right? Trying to get some sort of collective response, government response to these problems and regulating these issues. So he began using camera images to provide incontrovertible evidence of these problems, visually illustrating the cramped and poor living conditions, showing the truth of his words in a way that illustrations can always be said that there's a level of embellishment, right? But the directness of photography, the indexicality of the image makes it a little bit more difficult to make those kind of claims about photography. So his first and most influential publication, some of you are probably familiar with it, is the famous book, How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York. And this first appears in 1890. It contains some illustrations as well as halftone reproductions, which at this time they're not great, but they're good enough. So it's going to, his body of work, this is probably the most famous image from it, or one of them, 5 Cent Lodging. And you can see there's, six or seven figures in this space with the wood stove right there. You can only imagine. This book influenced reform on a national scale. In 1894, so just a couple years after, a committee called the Tenement House Committee is formed. A year later, they passed the Tenement Housing Act, which regulates tenants. It brings in stuff like typical code, what we would associate with code enforcement stuff, so like fire safety, room size regulations, these sort of things. It was also the first official document to include photographs as evidence for its need, so it's kind of interesting. These are homeless children sleeping outside, right? He also focused on crime and the problems of crime in these New York City slums. This is a famous one near 5 Points called Mulberry Street. This is another, one of the other really, really famous images from this body of work. And then here are some examples of the book. So it did include some illustrations as well as halftone photographs, halftone reproductions. This one's titled The Thief. As well as maps, right? So going back to the Geological Survey, a lot of reform movements at this time are very interested in science and using kind of the scientific method to really demonstrate the extent of these problems and the truth of these problems. And so, like we saw with the Westward Survey photographs, which were part of, the photographs are supplanted with maps and survey information, right? Similarly here, right, we're using maps, we're using photographs, we're using text, we're using firsthand account, right? Another famous figure who's going to follow shortly after Riis was Louis Hine. You're probably familiar with some of his images as well. Hine started as a sociology student and teacher. He began photographing immigrants at Ellis Island in the early 1900s. He realized, like Riis before him, that photography makes a real good tool for social reform. So in 1907, he photographs steelwork in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for part of an influential study called the Pittsburgh Survey. So here's a couple images from that. So Hine was particularly interested in problems of child labor. And here is just one page from the Pittsburgh Survey. You can see it was 1,683 pages here. It was quite extensive. So again, accommodating photographs alongside written text. So a year later, he goes to work for the National Child Labor Committee, which is a private nonprofit organization, obviously dedicated to ending child labor. His work was dangerous. These industries hid their immoral practices, so the public wasn't supposed to know the extent to which children were being used as a source of cheap labor. Hein received death threats from factory police and foremen. He was kicked out of, surely many, many places. Would not surprise me if he was beaten up once or twice. He'd disguise himself to gain access into these places. He would, sometimes dress up as a fire inspector. He would, suggest that he was there to document, to take photographs of industry. These tactics should sound familiar to anyone who's familiar with modern investigative journalism. So these are, the caption is loom workers, but these are straight up children. That's like a 5-year-old, if 5 years old, which is just crazy. The belt right there, that could probably take your hand off. So it's just, incredibly dangerous. Barefoot kid working in a cotton mill with exposed turn of the century industrial machinery. You can only imagine. And then this image again, right? The emotion in her eyes. Breaker boys. So these are coal miners, assuming that they would be involved in breaking the coal into smaller pieces. Here's more of them. Reese and Hines were among the first to use flash powder to create artificial light in obviously dimly lit situations like a coal mine. This is another example of new technology which allows the camera into places that were previously otherwise inaccessible. So Hines' work, alongside the efforts of the NCLC, led immediately, or nearly immediately. There's kind of, in researching this, it's interesting. Action was taken, but there was a lot of dispute between whether it's state or federal provenance to end this problem of child labor. But there were a number of state and federal regulations which happened almost as a direct result of his work that were aimed to combat the use of child labor. Basically, they banned the selling of goods that were produced through child labor. Was one of the first ones. Hein went on to document steelworkers during the construction of the Empire State Building. You guys might be familiar with this set of images. I'm sure you've seen this one. There is Louis Hine right there. Could you imagine? Not in a million years would I be out there. So, probably the most well-known social documentary project, especially in the United States, is going to be the work undertaken by the historical section of the Farm Security Administration and the Resettlement Administration. The images are popularly referred to as FSA photographs. It started out as the Resettlement Administration, and then was referred to as the Farm Security Administration. So this is a groundbreaking government-sponsored project that enlisted about a dozen or so photographers under the direction of a guy named Roy Stryker. And their goal was to create truthful visual statements about the social conditions and the impact of FSA RA programs. Kind of similar to Matthew Brady in the Civil War, Roy Stryker was the government liaison. He took care of all the logistics. He provided oversight, a budget. He had a lot of guidance as to what and how things were photographed. We'll talk more about that at the end of this discussion. You should know that the FSA and the RA, again, that's Farm Security Administration and Resettlement Administration, these were part of a broader series of programs, public works projects, reform and regulation known as the New Deal. And I hope you guys are familiar with the New Deal. This was a set of policies that were enacted by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that were intended to respond to the need for reform and relief in the wake of the Great Depression. So the FSA and RA specifically were aimed at providing relief for impoverished rural farmers who were struggling through the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is a period of drought and dust storms which destroyed huge swaths of American prairie and displaced hundreds of thousands, leaving them destitute. So the Resettlement Administration set up camps for migrant farm workers in California as these refugees from American prairie, so the Midwest and South, were migrating west away from the Dust Bowl. These programs were not very popular. The idea of buying exhausted land from poor farmers was expensive, and it was seen as socialist, right? The same battle cry that is cried today, was certainly in the 30s and 40s, much more of a terrifying prospect. And so here's some of the advertising behind it, right? The exhausted land, poor livestock, poor land use, poor wealth, poor diet, towards resettled in the West with better practice. So there was a lot of emphasis on educating rural farmers in better farming techniques to help prevent this sort of erosion that resulted or was exacerbated by drought causing the Dust Bowl. So these photographs represent an emotional plea to predominantly white middle-class Americans who are unfamiliar with the plight of rural farmers, of the need for these programs, and of their benefit. And it's really, the rhetoric of this look in her eyes, right? It screams for the establishing of an emotional connection with the subjects of these photos. And I think that is another characteristic social documentary thing is the goal of the images is to establish an emotional connection, to establish a level of compassion from the viewer to support whatever it is. In this case, New Deal programs, which are, aimed at trying to turn things around in the 30s in the wake of the Great Depression. So again, they really illustrate the emotional connection that social documentary tries to establish. And eventually the photos shift from portraying social problems to the positive impact of these programs, right? So they shift from showing why we need the programs and instead showing how the programs have helped. This might be a great example of, the positive aspects, the positive outcome of these programs. And, while these programs did have positive impacts and they did certainly help people, the shift in tone was largely a political one. For anybody that is unfamiliar with Depression history, what really ended the Great Depression in America was World War II. So there are, as I said, about a dozen or so FSA photographers. We are not going to talk about all of them. There's just not enough time. The FSA project is absolutely massive in scale. There's tens of thousands of images that are all public domain. So if you want to go and look through more of them, you can go to the Library of Congress website and you can find thousands and thousands and thousands of images from the FSA project. So we're going to talk about Dorothea Lange, who is one of the most prominent figures, if not the most prominent figure from the FSA. So Lange studied with pictorialist Clarence White. So he should sound familiar from last week's discussion with pictorial photography. He was one of the photosecession people, and he eventually went on to teach pictorial style photography at Columbia University, quite famously. The Clarence White School of Photography is what they refer to it as. So she was a student of Clarence White, and you can certainly see the pictorial influence in her work 100%. So she studied at Columbia in New York City before landing in San Francisco, where she worked at a portrait studio for a while. Somehow she was contracted to start photographing people on the street in the wake of the Great Depression. This image here, White Angel Breadline, is one of her first famous images, which helps get her hired to work for the FSA. And there she is, on top of what I presume is her Ford. So this is a 4x5, probably a Graflex press camera, it's called. It can fold up. It has bellows. So this is, today we would refer to it as a large format camera. It's not an 8x10 large format camera. It's a 4x5, so it's a smaller size, but it's still obviously a pretty big camera. Graflex was based out of Rochester, New York, right? Which makes sense, being that Kodak was in Rochester, New York, so there is some photo history happening over in Rochester. This is her most famous image. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this because I think this is a really an emblematic photograph in a number of different ways. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that in a second. Here she is in Arkansas. So she was focused more in the middle of the country and then in California. The migrant mother photograph was taken at a pea pickers camp in California, a migrant work camp or resettlement camp, right? Another temporary housing, person squatting in Bakersfield, California. A sharecropper and his son. So many of the rural farmers that these programs were directed towards were tenant farmers and sharecroppers. So they didn't own the land. They worked the land, and part of their crop paid the rent. And so obviously when they couldn't pay the rent, when they couldn't stay on the land, when it wasn't, producing any goods for them, they had to leave. So this is what led, the Dust Bowl is what led to the mass migration of poor tenant sharecropping farmers to the West. And this is probably an image that some of you are familiar with as well. If you watched Courage and the Cowardly Dog, Cartoon Network, I don't know, in the early 2000s, you're probably familiar with this scene. They kind of spoofed it. So providing very clear evidence of the conditions caused by the Dust Bowl. The road west. Very kind of barren, unforgiving kind of a scene, right? A family migrating. This is another famous image. So this is in North Carolina, Crossroads store. Looking at a lot of the FSA work, they were very, very attracted to signage and incorporating written language in their photographs. So she also would be hired by the government to photograph Japanese internment camps in World War II, and I assume that they hired her in hopes that she would paint a picture of how good the conditions were in these camps and how well everyone was being treated. Why you would look at her work from the FSA project and the level of compassion she has for her subjects, and not expect her to feel that same level of compassion for the Japanese being, forcibly put into prison essentially during World War II after Pearl Harbor, is kind of beyond me. But the government commissioned her to photograph these camps, and when her images were so obviously critical of the interning of American citizens, they were impounded, and they weren't seen publicly at all during the war until several years after the war. So that's a little bit about Dorothea Lange. We're going to come back to the migrant mother in a second, but I kind of just want to survey a very, very small snippet of work from the FSA project. So probably the other famous figure to come out of the FSA is Walker Evans. And Evans is the least sympathetic with the social aim of the FSA program, the FSA photography program. So that's not to say that he doesn't care about the people in his photographs or about, helping people, but his dedication is really more to straightforward documentation versus catering to a particular viewpoint that the FSA directors outlined for him. He's the only photographer to consistently use an 8x10 large format camera. When you compare the look of his photographs to Dorothea Lange, he's a little bit more modern and straight than Lange, who is much more, she has that Clarence White pictorial influence in the kind of portraits, right? He is much more direct. They're much flatter. He tends to do a lot of comparisons. Obviously here the straightforward presentation of these cookie cutter houses, and then the comparison, the juxtaposition between the signage and the houses. He works predominantly in the South. Here's another great one, right? Using, this is much more what straight photography, what seeing photographically is all about, what Edward Weston seeing photographically is all about. Seeing composition in the camera, and the kind of statement between the idealized illustration in the background and the reality for this figure here, particularly as a black man in the South in 1936, right? That's sort of the aesthetic that Walker Evans is all about. Much more oriented towards modernism, much more oriented towards Weston seeing photographically than Dorothea Lange. So again, he worked predominantly in the South. In 1936, while he was on leave from the FSA, he stayed with 3 families in Hale County, Alabama, and this work eventually becomes his famous book, titled Let Us All Now Praise Famous Men. So this is the Fields family, and this is one of the Burroughs family. Very straightforward, much flatter, much more kind of emotionally charged in the way that Lange's photos were. So the Let Us Now Praise Famous Men was originally a magazine assignment, and they ended up not publishing the text along with his images. So him and the guy who he was working on it with, whose name is eluding me right now, published it themselves a couple of years later. So that's a little bit about Walker Evans. We'll come back to his later project in a second. Rothstein is another notable figure. All of the photographers, Jack Delano, Lee, there's a number of really amazing. I mean, they're all really, really good. I wanted to keep this as straightforward as we could, as concise as we could. So definitely follow up in the book, follow up online, and take a look at some of the other figures. Rothstein is an interesting character, particularly because of the controversy surrounding this steer skull. Excuse me. So he takes this picture of a skull, and it winds up getting published. Whether he sells it or gives it or sends it to a newspaper, it winds up getting published. And then somehow people realize that there's several different pictures of this skull in several different locations. And there's a whole controversy about this skull being fake. The accusation that Rothstein was driving around in his car with a trunk full of props and placing them around in different places. And, he claims that these were experiments and they weren't really intended to be published, but they were published. And the image is kind of, when we think about Dust Bowl, drought, there's kind of a grisly message here. Although there were people interviewed by the newspaper in this controversy that, said, that's a flat. It looks like that every year. It has nothing to do with drought. And the prairie is littered with cow skulls. So this isn't evidence of any kind of drought or anything like that. And he was accused of moving the skull 10 feet. I mean, it also, whether it's this skull or a very similar skull, appears in other photographs altogether as well. So he said it was an experiment. It wasn't intended to be published. They were published. Obviously, there was controversy stirred up, particularly from a group, manufacturing party who they were not favoring the regulations that were being generated by New Deal, and they didn't like the FSA, and so they were looking for any reason to stir up trouble and cast doubt into these images. So their billboards, let me see if I can find it quickly. I feel like we're doing okay on time, so we can go this image here, the National Association of Manufacturers. So this was the organization, members of which stirred up the controversy surrounding Rothstein, and they were highly critical of New Deal programs, and obviously they launched this huge billboard campaign, to kind of say how great everything was in the United States in the 40s, and we don't need government regulation of industry, and we don't need these socialist programs, and blah blah blah. So they were very much kind of a conservative voice, and anytime the FSA, you see these billboards in multiple different FSA photographers' work, any chance they had to use one of these National Association of Manufacturers billboards, any chance they had to incorporate that in some sort of ironic way, they absolutely jumped on. So you see these billboards reappear in the work of several different FSA photographers. So that's kind of a short aside for you guys. So this is going to lead us into a critical view of some of these images. So right off the bat, right, the images from Rees, Hines, the FSA, other social documentary work, without a doubt, has a positive impact. Nobody is going to disagree with the fact that, like, tenement housing is bad, child labor is bad, drought, famine, starvation is bad. Without a doubt, these things had to be addressed. But there are some ethical questions surrounding documentary that I want to touch on. So all of these projects share a common denominator. They are aim directed. And a fancy academic term for something that's aim directed is teleological. I'll spell it for you. Teleological. Teleological. And what that means is that the action is shaped by the outcome. The end goal determines the approach as to how something is done. It's a very general term, but that'll get you there. And social documentary is more often than not purpose-driven. There is a problem which must be illustrated by photographs. So before the camera is even on the scene, there's a measure of selection as to what we're going to focus on, what we're going to look at, what are we going to hide, what are we going to show. And, as we discussed with Sarkowski in Photographer's Eye, right, the central act of photography is selection. So forget about Photoshop. If we're deciding what we're going to show and what we're going to exclude in a project that assumes transparency, do the photographs stand up as evidence when mobilized in that way? Does the claim of documentary as an unmanipulated view of reality, as a transparent window to these situations, does it hold up? So even if the photographer is as truthful as possible, as Walker Evans kind of aspired to be, the intervention of the camera changes the situation being photographed, right? Especially if you have a giant 8x10 camera. People see the camera and then they act differently. It happens. So Evans knew this, and he famously, in a later project, and we're looking at 1941 here, this is a very famous Walker Evans project. Alongside, he's more famous for this body of work, these New York City subway pictures, than he really is for his FSA work. He famously hid his camera inside of his coat and then used a cable release, which basically is a remote shutter trigger. It's a little spring wire thing that allows you to trip the shutter of a camera without actually pressing the button on top of the camera. So he ran that through his coat, down the arm of his jacket, into his hand in his pocket, and he painted all of the chrome bits of his Contax 35 millimeter camera. So he used a Contax smaller format, 35 millimeter format, right? Less conspicuous. People wouldn't know they're being photographed. They wouldn't react to the presence of the camera. And he painted it black. Any bit that was shiny or chrome that would draw attention, he painted it black. And that's a very street photographer technique, to tape the name of your camera, to tape anything that's attention grabbing with black gaffing tape. Very street. Right? So he did all of this to try to avoid having people realize his camera was present. So they would act completely normally. And the goal was to reduce the intervention of the camera, to present people as they naturally were, unaware of the presence of having their picture taken, which is a whole other ethical question. But so, calling back to our discussion about meaning in photography from a couple weeks ago, months ago, specifically I'm talking about the layers of meaning that are ascribed on top of a photograph. Remember the Tragedy by the Sea example that we looked at, and the impact of cropping, editing, retouching, image layout, and sequence, titling, text, amongst all of the others. So this series are the images that Lang took leading up to The Migrant Mother, right? So there was the most emotionally charged, evocative moment is the moment that was selected. Now, does that moment more accurately reflect the reality of this situation, or do these images as a set, tell us more? So the Migrant Mother photo right? We don't see that she has 5 kids. She actually ends up having 10, but that's not the point. Um, we don't see all the detail. It's much more selected in terms of what it shows. And what it shows is the most emotionally powerful frame, the one that best conveys the message, that best is going to emotionally impact the viewer, right? And so, obviously, this is OJ and not FSA, but when meaning is overlaid on top of photographs, right? As we discussed in regard to second order, first order signification, and second order signification, signification again being how meaning is going to be conveyed, whatever partial truth the camera might have captured is overridden, and it takes the form of whatever message is being told. So I thought this was a great example because it's literally the exact same photograph, and the only thing that changes is the way that the photograph has been deployed. So Newsweek is obviously casting a certain light onto OJ, and Time maybe a different one that's maybe slightly more sympathetic. So in regard to the FSA, I mentioned Roy Stryker. He's almost more famous than the photographers for his role in the FSA project. So he was the director of photography. He was the managing person. He ran all of the people, and he certainly knew how to get the most out of his photographers, and he enabled them to not worry about any sort of bureaucracy or anything like that. They were able to go out and take pictures. That was what he wanted them to do. And maybe he deserves some accolades in that regard, but he was also well known for being kind of a dictator, and he wrote very exacting guidance on how to approach events and places, and made really detailed shooting scripts, brainstorming ideas, and quite famously would literally punch holes through negatives that didn't fit the viewpoint that he wanted to ensure. So he is the editorial person on the other side, right? He is the one who's determining which photo best captures the message that he's trying to send. How is that photo going to be deployed? What sort of meaning is going to be ascribed on top of it? With the look into her eyes advertisement that we looked at earlier, right? So here is some of his material. You can find a lot of this. Again, this was a government project, so all of this stuff, you can find it on the Library of Congress website. This is some sort of note that he sent out to all photographers. Brogan he's an author who wrote a lot about kind of American culture. So this is kind of a brainstorming board, right? Like a word association, words, phrases, ideas. So something to give them inspiration, to kind of guide them. And then here's a straight up shooting script. So farmer needing rehabilitation. I'm sorry, this is a little bit blurry. His farm, making applications for a loan at the RA office, Resettlement Administration office. Agent discussing the matter with the farmer. Agent and farmer. I can't read. Checking land and equipment to see what the farmer needs, making out plans, receiving a check on loan. Farm wife and kids planting, canning, improved farm, everybody happy. Farmer entering the RA office to repay the loan. So very exacting. Very, and there are many. This is one shooting script. There are many different examples we can look at. And here is the hole punch negatives, right? So, I don't know. For me, this is violent. I believe he stopped doing this later because it pissed all of the photographers off to such a degree. Anybody who works with film, like, this is sacrilege to intentionally destroy an image. Feels bad. And I mean, there is a kind of editorial violence in this act. To me, it feels malicious almost, like. And then here's a letter. I thought this was particularly interesting. So Stryker wrote to FSA photographer Sheldon Dick as to how he should approach documenting a coal town called Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. So I'm not going to read this whole thing. It seems clear that Stryker scouted this location beforehand and likely had it personally selected as a spot to send somebody. And here's some quotes from this excerpt here. Refer to the general shooting script of American towns. Quote, everywhere I looked was man-made desolation, waste piles, bare hills, dirty streets. And then here is some direct advice. It is terribly important that you show the town against the background of waste piles and coal tipples. In short, it's a coal town, and your photographs should tell as much. And so I went through the trouble of searching for Sheldon Dick's photographs of Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. And looking at his photographs, like, he followed suit. He took Stryker's advice. And in his photographs, the town looks like a wasteland. So the FSA photographs they're considered to be the epitome of documentary photography. But when you look at them from this perspective, I mean, particularly from the punched holes, what's more important to Stryker? Telling the truth, creating a body of images which documents moments from the Depression, from the Dust Bowl, or telling a particular story, creating a particular narrative which demands the support of the middle class and demonstrates the success of these programs, right? For me, if you're interested in telling the truth and creating a body of work, you don't destroy that work when it doesn't fit into a certain viewpoint. So when you look at FSA, RA photographs from this perspective, the idea that they are truthful, a truthful, unmediated view, it totally falls apart. So I wouldn't necessarily label them outright propaganda. You know, the images are not complete fabrications. These are real people, real situations. The problems are real. I think the photographs do a good job of recording these things. And again, the collective scope of this body of images is absolutely massive. It's absolutely massive. I mean, similar to Brady's documentation of the Civil War, although on a much, much greater scale. But just to have a set of images, a visual record of that scope is, I don't know, it's huge. But I think it's important to remember the context, as with Brady and as with any photograph, right? The context in which the images were made, in this case particularly, is a very tightly controlled government-sponsored campaign with very, very specific goals, right? Okay. So one final point of criticism, and that has to do with the fact that these are real people. You know, this was a real person, and she's been turned into a symbol. The taking of somebody's image, taking their image and their agency away from them through photography and subsequent publication, which this image is a prime example of, you know, I think is ethically questionable, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So Lang is a she was famous for her empathy and compassion and the level of respect that she had towards the people in her photographs. She really sat above other FSA photographers for her compassion. She was famous for spending time with people, taking super detailed notes about who they were and what their story, like making sure she got all the details right, which makes this photo kind of sad. And, this is the migrant mother, obviously, mythical photo. It's the de facto symbol of the FSA project. Roy Stryker called it the ultimate photo of the Depression era. And for 40 years, the name of the person in this photo, the specific details of her story were not known. And uncharacteristic to Lang, the details that she did record were incorrect. And when the media caught up with the actual migrant mother, whose name is Florence Owens Thompson, like 40 years later in the 70s, here's what she had to say. And this is this is Thompson, this is the migrant mother speaking. And I quote, "I wish she hadn't taken my picture. I can't get a penny out of it. She didn't ask my name. She said she wouldn't sell the pictures. She said she'd send me a copy. She never did." So, obviously not pleased with her representation. Lang sent the image to the newspaper the next day. Before she even sent it to the FSA, she sent it to a California newspaper at Los Angeles or San Francisco, I can't remember. And, it was a big hit in the newspaper. And within a week, the migrant work camp that Thompson was at, received truckloads of food. So the photograph had an immediate and direct positive impact. Now, sadly, the Thompson family had already moved on, as migrant workers tend to do. So, while this photograph undoubtedly was impactful and emotionally compelling, and still is today, an image that directly inspired and helped people, and obviously, directly helped the people in the camp at the very, very least, it did very little to help the person whose image it actually came from, the person whose expression and body it uses so much to communicate its message. And obviously, she was less than pleased with the way that her picture was used. Once she was identified and she got some media attention, she received a lot of correspondence from people that were fans of the image, that found it moving, that found it as a source of inspiration and personal strength. She found pride in it, I think. She, got donations through a fundraiser for, I believe, some kind of cancer treatment. So she benefited partially, in some sense, from it. And, there was a reconciliation in her portrayal, I think, when she saw the impact it had on other people. The marker on her gravestone reads, "Florence Leona Thompson, migrant mother, a legend of the strength of American motherhood." So, she obviously took pride in the image at the end. And, despite this eventual reconciliation, it doesn't really change the fact that she had no agency in her role as a symbol. And, well, this was a government-sponsored program, so Lang didn't profit. None of these photographers profited directly from photos that they took. I mean, Lang certainly received a great deal of fame and accolade for this image, without a doubt. So, when I'm considering documentary work, I think back to this image and I ask questions like, does this work offer agency to the subject of the photograph? How is that person portrayed? How is their story told? How is the image used? Who's benefiting from the picture? What does the subject get out of it? What are they getting back? And I don't necessarily mean like financially or otherwise, but are they given agency into how they're represented? And in my opinion, the best documentary work is made in acknowledgement and collaboration with the subjects and with their implicit consent. If you're going to benefit in some way from using somebody's image in a photograph you are making, I feel like you should have some kind of consent from them, some kind of acknowledgement that they don't care that you're taking their picture. You know, so to kind of wrap up here, not to get it twisted and end on kind of like a sour note, these are important, necessary social movements, right? Child labor, tenement housing, code enforcement, famine, starvation, unemployment, ecological destruction from bad farm practice. These are important things that needed to be addressed, and the camera was an implicit part of their success, and it's played a part of the success of many, many social movements. There is no doubt that photography has the power to emotionally compel in a way that illustration, drawing, painting simply can't. It has a power to catalyze change, and I think if it's done with compassion, empathy, and collaboration, photography can be a really uplifting and empowering force for the subjects of photographs, as well as a champion of positive change. And when I say that, I feel like I'm asking, what does a subject of a photograph get out of a photograph? If they're uplifted or empowered in some way through having their photo taken, I consider that some kind of exchange that's worthwhile. And I think a lot of street photographers, a lot of documentary photographers who, make photographs, sell photographs, make a living off of using other people's images, tend to lean on that kind of justification, that there is an exchange, a mutual exchange on some level between subject and photographer. So for me, it's all about compassion, empathy, and collaboration with your subjects. So there is no doubt that photography can be a champion of positive change, and if it's done right, can be empowering for the people in photographs. I think particularly today, with the ease of access and digital technology, it enables more people to tell their own story. So I think it's much more empowering today than previous generations have had. Particularly, you don't have to rely on some sort of patriarchal figure to come in and help you. And I don't mean patriarchal necessarily as being man, but really more the patriarchal figure of the state, right? Being that we're looking at a lot of government related campaigns here. So despite this, right, despite acknowledging that photography can be a force for good, there is still an inherent power dynamic that tends to benefit those who are the makers of images rather than those who are the subjects. When we look at FSA photographs, we're not talking about the names of the people in the photographs. We're talking about the names of the people that took the photographs, right? And, this is a government-sponsored program, so nobody is directly profiting from selling things of other people's, selling images of other people's misfortune or anything like that. But, photojournalists and photojournalist photography, that's what you do. That's your job. So I think there is sometimes a questionable power dynamic between, again, makers of photographic images and subjects. And it's something that I think, particularly if you are a maker of photographic images, we should, think about that. Think about how we're interacting with the people in our photographs. So there's a slippery slope in regard to photographic truth. Many images have the illusion of being transparent viewpoints. I think, all of the FSA photographs look fairly straightforward, fairly transparent, right? But as we saw, their actual view is one that's much more carefully controlled and constructed. And, today we're more nuanced and we have a more, we're more familiar with truth in photography, being that we're all engaged with photography today. I think we tend to not think about photographic truth as much, and I've already said this in the semester before, but I'm going to say it again. But I still very much believe that there is still a slippery slope with photographic truth. Lens-based images are ubiquitously used in our society as visual evidence. Video, photographs, digital, printed, moving image. If this strategy of using visual evidence to support some sort of written or audible account of the world, what's happening, etc., advertising, whatever. If this strategy was no longer effective, it wouldn't be used. They would use something else. So I think it's empowering to have an understanding of how these meanings are constructed and used, and to be vigilant in considering how the camera is deployed. Of course, the exact same strategies discussed here within generally positive causes, child labor, tenement housing, starvation, ecological destruction, etc., generally positive things that should and needed to be addressed. These exact same strategies can be and are routinely deployed as outright propaganda by dictators, demagogues, and other, we'll say, less savory social and political forces. So we're going to leave it there. This was a very small window into social documentary work. These are some of the most iconic images, the most famous moments and figures, and these are kind of the epitome of the social documentary tradition in its origin. Some of the things that established it as a tradition. So there are many other examples, as I said about FSA work in particular. There are some 10 other photographers that we barely talked about. And obviously, social documentary is not specifically an American practice or an American invention, despite some of the prime examples coming from the United States. So I highly encourage you to, see the chapter in the book, and there's a following section that goes into more projects as well. So check those out, and I will follow up with you guys next week with the next chapter, chapter 9, and we will go from there. Again, if you have feedback, this was too loud, my voice is annoying, whatever, I want to hear, let me know, stay in touch. I'm on Discord. You can always email me if you want to have a face-to-face talk. We can set that up. I have Zoom. We're ready to go. So stay in touch, guys. I will talk to you soon.